As humans, we love a good story. We tell them around campfires, we write them on tablets, carve them on stone. We make epic poems and marble tombs and movies that span entire galaxies. Stories sustain us. They shape who we are and who we want to be. The story we tell about our planet is a compelling one. A neat progression from chipped stone tools to rockets leaving Earth's atmosphere. From firelight in dark caves to cities that never sleep. And the textbooks tell us it all happened in the blink of an eye, just a few thousand years of recorded history. It's a seductive narrative, comforting, familiar, complete. What if it's also wrong? What if the story we tell ourselves about the past is only one layer in a much deeper history? A history written in stone, soil, and sea, stretching back tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. A history of societies, technologies, and cultures we have not yet discovered. To even ask the question is to flirt with ridicule. Lost civilizations before recorded history? Isn't that just pseudo-archaeology? Atlantis revisited? Well, maybe. But as scientists, we have to ask what can be explained by the evidence we have and what we don't. And the evidence tells us this. We have no idea how deep the past runs. Yes, humans have walked the earth for at least 300,000 years, but most of that story is a mystery. Most of the physical record has been lost, and when it comes to the gaps in our history, we tend to fill them in with assumptions. We assume prehistory was a time of small bands of nomadic hunters and gatherers living in flimsy shelters, making crude tools from stones and bones. Was it really? After all, we have only been systematically excavating archaeological sites for a couple of hundred years. Most of these sites have been disturbed by plowing, looting, or development. Most are completely unknown. And of the ones we do know, most have been dated and categorized as primitive. But is that conclusion valid? Or are we simply seeing prehistory through the lens of our own culture? Are we imposing order on chaos, narrative on noise? Is there something in the silence that we have completely missed, something that might rewrite our understanding of the past? Like the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, a Neolithic site in southeastern Turkey that dates back at least 11,500 years, at a time when most of Europe and North America were still hunting wild game. The people who lived around Göbekli Tepe were creating monumental architecture. They carved enormous T-shaped pillars from limestone and arranged them in circles. They decorated the pillars with reliefs of animals, some real and some imaginary, and aligned the structures with the cardinal directions. There is no evidence of villages or settlements nearby, no obvious source of food or fresh water. Yet whoever came here obviously intended to stay a while. They must have gathered in the largest numbers when the pillars were erected, possibly for religious festivals or ceremonies. They may have traveled from distant settlements, bringing their skills and traditions with them. It seems impossible that such a site could have sprung up fully formed from a primitive tribal culture. It suggests there was more going on in prehistory than we have imagined. The prevailing theory now is that Göbekli Tepe was a gathering place for hunter-gatherers, a kind of proto-city. But that still leaves many questions unanswered. Where did the knowledge come from? Why did it suddenly appear? And where did it go? Gobesity is only the beginning. Beneath the earth are countless other layers, not just of dirt and rock, but of human activity, ingenuity, and accomplishment. It's not a stretch to imagine that our current understanding of prehistory is like a child's drawing, simple and charming, but ultimately incomplete. As more discoveries are made, our picture of the past will become more detailed, more nuanced, more complex. Maybe one day it will look like a mosaic, a tapestry, a galaxy. And at some point we will realize that we have been looking at the fragments all along. The question is, how do we fit them together? How do we make sense of a history that defies our expectations? And how do we listen for the voices that time has almost silenced? The story we tell ourselves about the past is a powerful tool. It shapes our identity, our culture, and our destiny. It is also a work in progress. And as we learn more about the past, Our story will change. Whether we discover a lost civilization or not, we have already lost so much. The cities of the Indus Valley were abandoned at least 4,000 years ago. Their secrets lie buried beneath the sands of time. The great Egyptian pyramids are all but gone. Only their outlines remain. The temples of Angkor Thom are choked by jungle vines. But their builders are long forgotten. What we find in the ruins of the past is not just broken stone, it is broken stories. The voices of billions of people are silenced, their cultures dissolved, their memories erased. Even the grand narratives of empires and kingdoms have crumbled to dust. But in the silence, we can still hear them. If we listen closely, we can hear the whisper of a lost civilization calling out to us from the darkness. A reminder that the story we tell ourselves about the past is only one story among many. The Earth is an old archive, massive, stubborn, inscrutable. Its documents are strata, their pages, centuries of silt and sediment, each layer only inches thick, but adding up over time. How do we read it? The traditional tools of archaeology are good for certain kinds of texts: testa, seeds, animal bones, charcoal from campfires. They yield their secrets with a bit of science. Ordinary dirt, however, is harder to crack. It is not like pulling a single page from a book, dusting it off, and deciphering the writing. With ordinary dirt, we deal in averages. We take samples from a site and compare them against other sites. We make probabilities. We say, this object was probably used here. This event likely happened here. This person probably lived here. This conclusion may be statistically sound, but it is hardly satisfying. Can we do better? Maybe we can learn from history. The discipline is young. Archaeology is barely a century old, but even in that time, we have changed how we read the Earth's archives. Once upon a time, archaeologists accepted that most of human prehistory was a blank slate. They called it the Neolithic Gap. Nothing much happened until farming, they said, until the Bronze Age. Everything before that was primitive, simple, unimportant. It was a textbook example of scientific hubris. And over time, scholars began to chip away at the Neolithic Gap. Year by year, new discoveries forced them to rewrite history. Instead of a sudden leap from hunting and gathering to sophisticated urban societies, archaeologists see a gradual emergence of complexity. Small groups grew into villages, then towns. Villages specialized in crafts or food. Towns traded and warred. Some stayed small, others got big. And we were wrong to think these changes were random. New technologies did help drive them, like pottery and plows, houses and harpoons. But it was really social change that scaled human societies up, the ability to cooperate, organize, lead, innovate. These skills are hard to acquire. But once acquired, they can compound, grow, improve. And that may explain why complex societies keep emerging. Across the globe, long before agriculture, humans organized themselves into large cooperative groups. Think of the bison hunt, the mammoth corral, the elaborate strategy needed to wrangle 2 tons of muscle for weeks. It takes time to build such coordination, even more time to sustain it. Today we forget how remarkable this is. Every year, dozens of prehistoric sites push back the timeline. For instance, the earliest known pyramids in the Americas date back almost 3,000 years. But in the 1990s, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a previously unknown ceremonial center in Montana. It's called the Great Coulee, and according to radiocarbon dating, it was occupied around 3,500 BC, maybe earlier. It was the size of Stonehenge, but rather than standing stones, it was made of dirt mounds and ditches, arranged in a huge circular pattern. Around it were burials, carefully dug pits filled with grave goods, including copper tools, shells from the distant Pacific Ocean, and fragments of rock art. All told, the coulees lay abandoned for 1,000 years before construction began. Their builders were nomadic hunters, not farmers. Yet they understood complex geometry. They could plan in advance. They had leaders and followers. They could manage resources. and then they abandoned the site again. Why? No one knows. But it is clear that big plans were possible long before cities and states and palaces. There were risks, of course. Societies rose and fell. One scholar estimates that 90% of pre-literate societies are extinct. Only a tiny minority gave rise to modern states. But the larger point is this: if it happened once, it could happen again. If hunter-gatherers could organize, then why couldn't we? If nomadic tribes could construct monuments, why couldn't we? And if ancient societies could support billions, why couldn't we? We may think of ancient history as backwards, but compared to our own time, we are still learning. In many ways, we are doing history backwards. Our earliest sources are often our latest discoveries. By the time we get around to investigating them, we have already filtered them through our own understanding of the past. And so, we need a new approach. We need to read the Earth's archives more like literary texts, to treat each layer as a complete narrative, a distinct account of a particular moment. It sounds strange, but the idea isn't new. Half a century ago, a professor at Harvard taught what he called deep-time archaeology. He was trained in physics, and he applied the scientific method of multiple testing to history. His strategy was to pick an area and dig everywhere, excavate as many sites as possible, taking samples from each layer, collecting as much data as possible. If his hunch was right, he reasoned, his results should replicate across sites. It worked. The data confirmed his hunches, and soon his students took up the mantle. Each new discovery added to the record, each new site added to the confirmation. As the decades passed, the theory was refined, and eventually it won acceptance among mainstream scholars. That theory is called the Neolithic Transition Theory. It describes how humans moved from being nomadic to settling down, from hunting to herding, from simple huts to more durable houses, from living in bands to living in villages. Again, none of this happened overnight. The transition took thousands of years, but suddenly it didn't seem so surprising. In fact, it felt inevitable. Going deeper, we can apply the same method to any period. Take the collapse of Maya cities, for instance. Conventional wisdom says it happened quickly, suddenly. Scholars identified several environmental stressors that peaked around the year 800 AD: drought, soil erosion, changing weather patterns, perhaps even a hurricane or two. Those conditions surely played a role, but we can see that in the sediments. Years of study have revealed that the worst drought coincided with the city's greatest population and economic peak. Soil erosion and declining rainfall may have made life harder, but according to the carbon isotope record, there was no mass starvation. The Maya didn't all leave because their fields were turning to dust. They were pushed out, murdered, displaced. Evidence of violence and dispossession also appears in the archaeological record: broken sculpture, damaged monuments, buildings set to waste. From the sediments, we can even gauge the intensity of the struggle. For instance, one team of scientists studied ancient DNA from Belize. Over the last 2,000 years, 3 distinct populations have lived in the region: the ancient Maya, newcomers from the south, and modern descendants of both. According to their analysis, the Maya were attacked repeatedly, maybe even genocided. Their genes show signatures of stress and inbreeding, suggesting that survivors mated with close relatives to preserve their bloodline. Whatever caused the collapse, violence and human agency appear to have played a big part. It wasn't nature alone, but nature plus something else. In fact, the only thing constant in human history is change. Climate shifts, yes, but also trade routes and empires and agricultural innovation and wars. Reading the Earth reveals all this, but we need to start thinking like geologists, except instead of epochs and eras, we deal in generations, centuries, individuals. Each tells a story, each deserves an audience. As we unearth these stories, we will find answers but also new questions. It is the nature of inquiry. But there is another reason to listen to the Earth. History has lessons. It reminds us of the unexpected. It shows us what is possible. And sometimes it offers a warning. In a world that seems more permanent than ever, that is an important perspective. What if someone asked you to identify a wrecked spaceship in a junkyard? Chances are you wouldn't see it. Spaceships aren't exactly common in junkyards. You'd be trained to recognize something else instead. Like any good scientist, you'd look for patterns, use your frame of reference to filter out the irrelevant. But here's the thing. If the spaceship was made of ordinary scrap metal, say an old oil drum, some corrugated iron, a length of rusted pipe, it probably wouldn't stand out at all. Not until you learned that spaceships exist. Then you might start looking for them. Scientists face the same bias. They interpret data through the lens of existing knowledge and ideas. Our picture of history is based on what we have found so far, not what we might miss. This is what makes the Silurian hypothesis so fascinating. It forces us to confront the limits of our own perception, the danger of interpreting data through a single story lens. Picture this. You're a geologist studying sedimentary layers 400 million years old. Your frame of reference is solid. There's a nice progression of fossils up the sequence. Marine critters in the lower layers, giving way to early tetrapods higher up. But then you spot something odd, a sudden spike in carbon dioxide levels right at the top of the sequence. Does this represent a real change, a blip in the planet's history? Or is it an outlier? A data point that doesn't fit the expected pattern. Is it real or is it just noise? Well, our conventional wisdom says that no civilization could have existed back then. Certainly not one capable of altering the atmosphere. So the spike must be an error. But what if I told you that it's reasonable to think that the first civilizations arose 500 million years ago and left their mark on the carbon isotopes? Would you believe me? Probably not. But what if I said the evidence is right there in front of you? Now imagine that these ancient humans were not quite human, that their bones and fossils are chemically indistinguishable from other animals. Imagine that they built no monuments, crafted no artifacts, left no trace except their architecture, their cities buried beneath the sediment. If they didn't leave anything behind, they certainly won't be in the fossil record, so the pattern would be invisible. This is not a far-fetched hypothetical. It's likely more realistic than you think. Between the Cambrian explosion and the Devonian mass extinction, life exploded onto the scene and quickly diversified into virtually every environment on Earth. Given enough time and the right conditions, it's reasonable to think that large animals evolved intelligence. Given a few more million years, it's reasonable to think that they would build technology, societies, cities, vehicles. After all, if it took apes 2 million years to make stone tools and 12,000 years to build skyscrapers, it's reasonable to think that other animals could do the same. A few million years is nothing in evolutionary terms. But if their cities were made of organic material, if their buildings were made of mud brick or wood, there would be no trace of them in the fossil record. At best, we'd find subtle chemical changes in the sediment, spikes in certain isotopes or elemental abundances, tiny shifts in mineral composition. Unfortunately, those signals would almost certainly be erased by erosion. So how long does it take for civilization to leave its mark? If we continue to deposit layers of trash and concrete and plastics at the current rate, in 1 million years, the sum total of our civilization will be a 10-meter thick layer of garbage. In 10 million years, that will be compressed to a mere 1 meter. In 100 million years, it will be less than 1 centimeter thick. In 1 billion years, our entire industrial age will be a couple of millimeters of sediment. And that's just the stuff we make, not the stuff we consume or the waste we produce. So the chances of finding plastic or concrete 1 billion years from now are essentially zero. In fact, if another civilization predates ours by even a few million years, the chances of finding its material culture will also be close to zero, unless we get lucky. If we want to understand our world, we need to look beyond our own story, broaden our frame of reference, Ask different questions. If we do, we might find that we are not alone. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as mere fantasy. Tales of gods and giants and great floods and forgotten ages were seen as symbolic, poetic, or simply made up. But in recent decades, a new approach has emerged, one that treats myth not as superstition, but as cultural memory. Passed down for generations, these stories may encode real events refracted through the lens of metaphor, belief, and time. And when examined closely, patterns emerge. Take, for example, the most widespread myth of all, the flood myth. It appears almost everywhere. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian god warns Utnapishtim of a coming deluge. He builds a boat, saves animals, and survives the flood. In the book of Genesis, Noah does the same. In India's Satapatha Brahmana, the god Vishnu takes the form of a fish to warn Manu of rising waters. In the Maya Popol Vuh, previous worlds end in floods. In Aboriginal Australian stories, rising seas swallow coastlines. In Norse myth, the world is drowned before rebirth. These stories span continents and languages. They were written or spoken thousands of years apart, and yet the themes are strikingly consistent. A great civilization, a warning ignored, a flood, and a world lost. Coincidence or something else? During the end of the last ice age, global temperatures rose sharply. Glaciers melted. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet, not all at once, but in surges. Sometimes these events were sudden. The Meltwater Pulse 1A event, for example, raised sea levels by over 20 feet in less than 500 years. That's fast enough to drown coastlines and displace entire populations. Imagine living on those coasts, watching the water inch higher, season after season, watching rivers swell, forests disappear, and finally, as the seas rushed in, everything gone. No writing, no satellite data, just memory and story passed down by survivors, generation after generation, until it became myth, and myth became legend. Plato's story of Atlantis, for instance, is often cited and just as often dismissed. Written in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues, Plato describes a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, a naval power. Technologically advanced, but morally corrupt. In a single day and night, it is swallowed by the sea. Most scholars see this as allegory, a philosophical metaphor for hubris and decline. But what if Plato was preserving an older story, one he heard from Egyptian priests who claimed it came from their own ancient records? If Atlantis was real, it may not have been a single city, but a stand-in for multiple coastal cultures lost during post-glacial sea level rise. Plato's dates might be symbolic, his geography speculative, but the core idea, a world-ending flood and a forgotten people, matches stories found across the globe. Even in the Americas, flood stories abound. The Hopi tell of previous worlds destroyed by water. The Inca speak of a time when the sun vanished and the earth was flooded. The Ojibwe describe water covering the land with a few survivors floating on the back of a giant turtle. What are these if not fragments of memory woven into culture? Distorted, yes, but not meaningless. Then there are the stories of the first times, golden ages when people lived in peace, in harmony, with knowledge lost in later eras. In West African oral tradition, there are tales of ancient empires long gone that built with metals unknown today. In Indian texts like the Mahabharata, wars are described with terrifying weapons, flying machines, fire from the sky, cities turned to ash. To the modern reader, these stories sound fantastical, but remember, myth is often metaphor. Fire from the sky might not be a god's wrath, but a memory of catastrophe. War in the heavens may be a poetic way of describing a very real destruction. So the question becomes, can myth carry truth? Even if it's not literal, more and more scholars are beginning to say yes. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories tell of landscapes that match prehistoric geography, now submerged. In Siberia, Legends of exploding mountains correspond with known volcanic eruptions. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous stories of great waves and ground-shaking beasts are now understood as oral accounts of ancient tsunamis and earthquakes. These are not coincidences. They are proof that oral tradition can preserve real events, even tens of thousands of years old. So when we hear tales of lost cities, sunken lands, or ancient peoples who reached for the stars, we must ask, what are they trying to tell us? Maybe they're echoes, garbled, fragmented, distorted by time, but echoes nonetheless of a deeper truth. Not that gods built machines, but that people once did. Not that towers touch the sky, but that once, long ago, someone built higher than we imagined was possible for their time. And when it all fell, the memory didn't disappear. It transformed into myth, into legend, into the stories that carried fragments of their world into ours. I'm the host. This is the author. And thanks for watching this episode, which was brought to you by a team of historians and a production company. I've been lucky enough to see a number of strange archaeological discoveries in my travels, things that made me wonder about the story of humanity and our place in the universe. So when I heard about a mysterious structure in Turkey, I knew I had to go there myself to see what the fuss was all about. The thing is, it wasn't really a fuss. Nobody much had heard of Göbekli Tepe. It was 1994, and the site was so obscure that the local officials didn't even know how to spell its name when I arrived. With my companion, the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, we soon saw why. Göbekli Tepe translates roughly to Potbelly Hill, hardly a name to strike terror into the hearts of scholars. But we knew better. We could see from the surrounding hills that this particular potbelly was special. There were several mounds in the area, but Göbekli Tepe was clearly the largest. The tell, as it's called, was an artificial mound created by successive layers of human activity over millennia. As we started excavating, we quickly realized that we were dealing with something unique, perhaps once in a lifetime unique. Here was the oldest monumental architecture ever discovered, going back 12,000 years. We also found figurines, many of animals, but two of humans. One was male, the other female. The male figurine stood out because it was carved in an extraordinarily detailed style, perhaps intended to represent a deity. We realized that we had stumbled upon the origins of human civilization. This is where it all began. Well, almost. While other archaeologists debate the precise role of sites like Göbekli, we can be certain that it represents a radical departure in human history. We know that people had lived in small, scattered settlements for tens of thousands of years before then, but there was no concept of cities or states or indeed of any large-scale organization of people. At Göbekli Tepe, however, there was clear evidence of communal action on a grand scale, implying the existence of an organized society. In short, it was the cradle of civilization, and yet, curiously, it was also its own antithesis. It was built, after all, at the end of the last ice age, a time when hunting and gathering was giving way to settled agriculture and animal domestication. But instead of using its newfound influence over nature, the society that built Göbekli Tepe chose to use its power to bring people together in worship of the natural world. Its hunters, its builders, its shamans, its priests saw themselves as part of the web of life, living in harmony with all creatures great and small. This philosophy inspired countless civilizations in the millennia that followed, from the Greeks to the Aztecs. It was humankind's first great experiment in social organization, and it succeeded brilliantly until it didn't. As the millennia passed, Göbekli Tepe and its sister settlements were abandoned, perhaps because of changing environments, perhaps because of internal strife. Whatever happened, the lessons of those early societies were lost, at least until the modern era, when humans, having exhausted the possibilities of war and destruction, are rediscovering the wisdom of the ancients. Today, people from all over the world come to Göbekli Tepe to marvel at the genius of a bygone age, to stand among the ruins and contemplate the mysteries of a forgotten past. For what is a civilization but the sum total of its accomplishments, its art, its science, its aspirations? Göbekli reminds us that even the greatest of these can vanish without a trace, leaving nothing but a potbelly hill to mark the spot. And yet it also shows us that the spirit of innovation, the desire to understand and shape the world around us, that can never be extinguished. It's part of our DNA, our deepest instincts, and it will endure for as long as we do. I am convinced there was a lost civilization that predates history. How do I know this? Because humans are storytelling creatures, and we find stories wherever we look. Stories encoded in rock paintings, in mounds, in pyramids, in stone hinges. In every corner of the globe, there are traces of a past reality. But as the years pass, those traces fade. Those stories become more fragmented, more difficult to understand. In essence, we've always lived in civilizations, society, culture, the very notion of living together. These are all achievements of our ancestors. But how far back does this go? When did this way of life start? And how did it evolve? Conventional history suggests a slow climb out of prehistory, marked by significant moments, but also many transitional phases. We think of the agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the rise of states, then empires. All these stages were real, and yet there are gaps in the record. Phases that were, in fact, much more abrupt than previously thought. We tend to think of our ancestors as progressing steadily toward modern civilization, but the truth is closer to a series of lurches and changes that we are only beginning to understand. So how far back does organized society really reach? Is it possible that conventional history has missed something fundamental? Could there be a prehistory, not of humans, but of civilizations? If such a civilization had existed before history began, its traces would be subtle, fragmented, misunderstood. We wouldn't expect to find shining cities beneath the sands or blueprints etched in stone. We would find outliers, inconvenient objects, things that don't quite fit, that are either dismissed, debated, or quietly forgotten. They are known, often pejoratively, as out-of-place artifacts, parts. To mainstream science, most of these artifacts are misinterpretations, hoaxes, or honest mistakes, and often that's true. But a few remain stubbornly unresolved, objects that don't belong in the strata or context in which they're found. Tools or patterns too advanced for the supposed timeline, items that raise questions the historical framework is not ready to answer. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, it appeared at first to be little more than a lump of corroded bronze. But over decades of study, X-ray imaging revealed its astonishing complexity. Over 30 interlocking gears in a compact housing, designed to model astronomical positions, predict eclipses, and track planetary motions with extraordinary precision. It dates to the 2nd century BCE, and nothing else like it would appear in the historical record for over 1,000 years. We know where it came from. We can place it in a cultural context. And yet it still challenges our assumptions about ancient technological sophistication. Now imagine discovering such a device, but with no context, no shipwreck, no inscriptions, no clear provenance. Just a gear or a shard of engineered material in a layer of earth dated far earlier than expected. Would it even be recognized for what it was? There are other anomalies. In the 1960s, stone tools were found in Mexico's Valsequillo Basin. The site, known as Hueyatlaco, was excavated under careful supervision. The tools were crude, but the stratigraphy was clear. The layers in which they were found dated, through multiple lines of evidence, to over 200,000 years ago. That date was so far outside the accepted timeline for human presence in the Americas that the findings were met not with excitement, but with controversy and professional risk. The lead archaeologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, distanced herself from the conclusions. Later, researchers who tried to revisit the data faced funding problems and skepticism. Yet the evidence remains. In Africa, footprints preserved in volcanic ash date nearly 4 million years old. They show clear signs of bipedal walking, of hominins moving in pairs, possibly families, not civilization, but intention, social behavior, a shadow of the self-awareness that would later build cities. In South America, stone spheres, massive and perfectly shaped, lie scattered across the jungles of Costa Rica. Their purpose is unknown, their makers unnamed. They serve no clear function, no inscriptions, no explanation. Are they ceremonial? Are they natural? Are they remnants of a culture whose records have not survived? Even in our own time, the Sahara reveals hints of something more. Beneath its sands lie structures and ruins not yet fully explored. Satellite imagery shows patterns, straight lines, regular shapes, buried under dunes. Are these simple geological forms or the buried bones of an older world? And underwater, the puzzles deepen. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found submerged structures, stone blocks and walls in geometric patterns, at depths suggesting they were last above water over 9,000 years ago. Further south in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar has revealed what some claim to be city-like grids beneath 120 feet of water. These findings remain contested. Some say they are natural formations. Others believe they are proof of human habitation long before the conventional rise of civilization. We cannot yet say which is true, but again, the pattern emerges. The anomalies do not form a clear picture. They do not scream their meaning. They whisper. And often we are too loud with our assumptions to hear them. If we expect simplicity, we will not recognize sophistication. If we assume a timeline, we will not question an outlier. And so these artifacts, the spheres, the mechanisms, the stone tools in impossible strata, remain on the fringes, collected, documented, then shelved. But what if we paused, set aside the expectation, and asked, not what should be here, but what is? In doing so, we might begin to see a different picture, not proof, but possibility. Not a lost civilization shining brightly across time, but one glimpsed only in fragments, a presence obscured not by secrecy, but by time, not by conspiracy, but by the quiet, persistent forgetting of the earth itself. And in this shadowed space, we can begin to ask a deeper question. What might such a civilization have looked like? Not just in terms of buildings or tools, but in values, in systems, in choices. Would it resemble us, or be something wholly other? It is easy to dismiss out-of-place artifacts as exceptions, as oddities. After all, if they were part of a coherent system, they would not be out of place. But perhaps they are part of the problem. If we conceive of the past through a series of discrete objects, disconnected pieces of stuff, we will miss the underlying patterns. But if we approach the past as an unfolding story, written in many hands across the millennia, then we are more likely to see how each artifact contributes to the whole. We must abandon the idea that the past is a set of static things and accept that it was a process of becoming. To do this, we must relinquish control. The desire to impose order is understandable. We want a coherent narrative. We want to see progress. But to find the unexpected, we must allow the past to surprise us. We must let the evidence lead us. This approach may not give us the answers we want, but it will increase the quality of our questions. It will allow us to move beyond yes or no, true or false, fact or fiction. It will force us to embrace the messiness of existence. Ultimately, the goal is not to build certainty, but to expand possibility. As we stand on the threshold of a brave new world, it is easy to look back at the past with nostalgia, but the further back we go, the less familiar the world becomes. Every era presents its own mix of challenge and opportunity. Can we learn from the successes and failures of previous civilizations? Absolutely. But can we ever truly recapture them? Can we ever step back into the consciousness of people long gone? Can we understand their values, beliefs, habits, rhythms, emotions? Not really. The past is forever out of reach. The gap between then and now is unbridgeable. And yet, in the attempt to cross that divide, we discover more about ourselves. For every mystery we solve, we deepen two more. For every artifact we understand, we reveal a dozen others. The more we learn about the past, the more we realize how much we don't. And in this realization lies both the humbling and the power of history. It compels us to keep searching. In the end, we will never prove the existence of a prehistory of civilization. But we can keep asking the question, and thereby keep alive the possibility that the story we tell ourselves about the past is not the only one. In a world that often feels unbearably complex, the temptation to simplify, to categorize, to reduce everything to its simplest terms is strong. But what if instead we embrace the inherent messiness of existence? What if we learn to listen to the whispers of the past, even when they challenge our expectations or defy our understanding? What if we stopped trying to fit every experience into neat little boxes and instead allowed ourselves to be surprised, to be challenged, to be moved by the echoes of what once was? Maybe in that messiness lies our humanity, our capacity for wonder, for adaptation, for change. And maybe in embracing it, we can find a new way forward. We are the dominant force on the planet. Our cities dwarf anything that came before. Our machines roam freely, climb into orbit, tunnel beneath the sea. The story goes that we accomplished this through innovation. First the wheel, then the loom, then steam, then electricity. Each leap added to the last until we arrived at this. So it surprises us when we consider there might have been others who traveled the same path, others who built monuments, crafted technologies, wove cultures. It seems inconceivable that there weren't. This is what we mean when we talk about advanced civilizations. Societies capable of the very things we credit with our own development. But there's an even deeper sense in which we are the most advanced civilization in the history of the planet. We are the most complicated. Take a single individual. The human brain is the most complicated structure known to science. Our nervous system is a high-speed communication network with the capacity for language, strategy, love, empathy. Given enough brains organized into a society, anything becomes possible. At least that's the theory. In practice, we see competing forces. Brains compete for resources, jostle for power, destroy each other. So when we imagine an advanced civilization, our minds go immediately to our own reflection. Skyscrapers, satellites, highways, plastics, energy grids, a world mapped, electrified, connected, a world made of noise and light. A world we take for granted because it's the only one we've ever known. But must civilization look like ours to be advanced? If another society existed in Earth's deep past, there's no reason to assume it followed our path, no reason to assume it discovered the same things in the same order, in the same way. Intelligence does not guarantee industrialization. Sophistication does not demand smoke and steel. It's possible, even likely, that an ancient civilization shaped by a different climate, different challenges, and a different worldview might have chosen a path we would not recognize as modern at all. Consider a civilization rooted in ecological harmony rather than domination. A society whose apex of achievement was not to bend nature to its will, but to live with it in balance. A culture that did not believe itself superior to the rest of the biosphere, but saw itself as part of it. It's easy to dismiss such a concept as naive, primitive, unsustainable. Yet we can observe similar dynamics in nature. In ant colonies, for instance, each member of the colony pursues tasks related to its physiology. Some ants farm, tending the fungus gardens in which the colony feeds. Other ants fight, defending the nest against intruders. Still others swarm and flood a threat with sheer numbers. The queen lays eggs, producing ever more ants to sustain the colony. From afar, an anthill may appear chaotic, but up close, there's a logic to it. Behavior emerges from simple interactions between individuals and the environment. Can we discern something similar in the archaeological record? It's hard to say. Many scholars believe early humans employed technologies sophisticated enough to meet their needs. In Africa, where humans evolved, we find evidence of tool use dating back 500,000 years. Those tools were crude by our standards, but suited to the task of scavenging carcasses and foraging. As humans migrated around the globe, we find evidence of new tools suited to new environments, including plows, boats, and weapons of war. Is it possible that somewhere along the line, one of these technologies allowed early humans to interface with their surroundings in a wholly new way? Not through conquest or exploitation, but through understanding and cooperation. We know that during the Holocene epoch, which began 12,000 years ago, the Earth was warmer than today. Global temperatures peaked around 9,500 years ago and have been declining since. During this period, we know that humans domesticated plants and animals and settled into villages. Is it possible that this was accomplished not through force but through reciprocity? Imagine a civilization that learned to read nature not as a dominion to be had, but as a series of relationships to be cultivated. It may sound fanciful, but it fits with what we know of human adaptability and intelligence. It also aligns with findings from the Yucatan, where archaeologists discovered evidence of ancient humans cultivating plants in a manner we might describe as symbiotic. They selected plants with desirable traits and encouraged their growth through selective breeding. But they didn't restrict the plants to neat rows or fences or fields. They grew wild, unconfined. This fits with a worldview that didn't separate humans from nature, but wove them together. It also hints at a level of sophistication in farming, one that modern science is only now rediscovering. But to develop such practices, you need time, and here is where our perspective fails. The Holocene epoch ended 11,700 years ago. Since then, the Earth has cooled, ice sheets have grown, sea levels have fallen, and humans have greatly expanded their technological capacity. It's easy to imagine a timeline that runs from hunting and gathering to agriculture to industrialization to where we are now, but it's equally possible that each of these phases unfolded over thousands of years. Maybe the shift from hunting and gathering to settled life was a slow, subtle process. People didn't suddenly decide to stay put and farm. They gradually experimented with domesticating plants and animals, perhaps beginning with preserving seeds from their favorite wild foods and then replanting them. Maybe they noticed that a plant they liked to eat grew near a particular animal whose young they already hunted. Maybe they started throwing scraps to the animals and then planting in proximity. Maybe they observed the habits of wild animals and mimicked those behaviors. Over many generations, maybe they found that the soil where they settled was poor and lacking in nutrients, so they brought in compost or manure and mixed it in. Maybe they even began to understand the role of microorganisms and their importance in growing healthy crops. This gradual process could have played out with other technologies as well, like plows and boats and weapons. Tools may have changed slowly, generation to generation, until one day they became efficient enough to support large groups of people living in one place. It's a subtle progression, hard to perceive on a map, impossible to mark on a timeline. This is the fallacy of our own experience. We don't remember the transition to farming or the adoption of iron tools or the Industrial Revolution as anything less than sudden. In fact, it took centuries, in some cases millennia, for these changes to become widespread. But this fallacy prevents us from imagining a much older civilization pursuing the same trajectory. Maybe the advancements of such a society were unrecognizable to us because they happened too slowly to be obvious. Or maybe they were easily erased by the next ice age, the rising sea levels, the next great migration. But what if an advanced civilization did develop technology recognizable to us, like metallurgy or astronomy or engineering, like cities and roads? Like ours, it rose and then fell, leaving behind only the barest chemical ghosts, traces of metals, foundations of buildings, shards of pottery, tools, and weapons. Are there any examples of this? We know that dozens of cultures around the world developed metallurgy independently, often within a few hundred years of each other. Copper tools have been dated to as early as 7,000 TARS BCE. Bronze and then iron soon followed. We also know that several cultures around the world built impressive structures, including the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Norte Chico civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. But how long did it take them to do so? Did it happen quickly or slowly? Again, we lack perspective. We tend to equate complexity with metal and progress with scale. But in doing so, we blind ourselves to other forms of advancement, the kinds that do not leave scars. Take the Dogon of Mali, for instance. Over several millennia, they created a culture with social structures and astronomical knowledge so complex it seems almost alien to Western observers. How did they do it without metal tools or towering monuments? The answer is nuance. Imagine a hunter-gatherer band with the social structure of a beehive. Members specialize in tasks based on their abilities and interests, not because someone appointed them to the position, but because everyone benefits from their contributions. As the group grows, so does the division of labor. Over time, the group becomes self-governing. Decisions are made democratically. Disputes are mediated by respected members. Stability becomes the norm. This stability could allow the group to thrive, to prosper. With security comes leisure. People have time to pursue interests, explore ideas, craft innovations. We don't think of hunter-gatherers as having much leisure time, but we also forget that they were not confined to a single territory or subject to the whims of unpredictable weather. Hunter-gatherers could follow food sources, could migrate to where conditions were clement, and resources were plentiful. They were not tethered to a single spot like farmers. And with freedom of movement came freedom of thought. In such a society, an individual could wander away if they disagreed with a leader or felt oppressed by rules. They could explore new ideas without fear of persecution, and that is why such a society might have thrived for generations or centuries, developing technology, building structures, making discoveries, without metal, without cities, without hierarchy. We call these characteristics primitive, but they are precisely what make us most afraid to consider them advanced. What if instead of looking for civilizations that mirrored our own, we looked for ones that didn't? What if we searched not for evidence of bronze and concrete, but biodegradable materials? What if we didn't look for towers, but for networks, a society that spread organically across the landscape, surviving for centuries because it solved problems without imposing solutions? Such a society might not leave ruins of stone, but gardens, patterns, soil enriched in strange ways, genetic traces in crops or animals long since naturalized. We tend to think of civilizations as complex, hierarchical, highly stratified. But what if we underestimated the longevity of egalitarian societies? What if we think of prehistory as a dark, unbroken mass because we can't see through it, because we don't want to see through it? Because what if we did and found something familiar staring back at us? Because what if we are walking over the graves of forgotten worlds and we don't know it? What if the dawn of civilization isn't a beginning, but the latest flicker of a very old flame? We are the dominant force on the planet. Our cities dwarf anything that came before. Our machines roam freely, climb into orbit, tunnel beneath the sea. The story goes that we accomplished this through innovation. First the wheel, then the loom, then steam, then electricity. Each leap added to the last until we arrived at this. So it surprises us when we consider there might have been others who traveled the same path, others who built monuments, crafted technologies, wove cultures. It seems inconceivable that there weren't. This is what we mean when we talk about advanced civilizations. Societies capable of the very things we credit with our own development. But there's an even deeper sense in which we are the most advanced civilization in the history of the planet. We are the most complicated. Take a single individual. The human brain is the most complicated structure known to science. Our nervous system is a high-speed communication network with the capacity for language, strategy, love, empathy. Given enough brains organized into a society, anything becomes possible. At least that's the theory. In practice, we see competing forces. Brains compete for resources, jostle for power, destroy each other. So when we imagine an advanced civilization, our minds go immediately to our own reflection. Skyscrapers, satellites, highways, plastics, energy grids, a world mapped, electrified, connected, a world made of noise and light. A world we take for granted because it's the only one we've ever known. But must civilization look like ours to be advanced? If another society existed in Earth's deep past, there's no reason to assume it followed our path, no reason to assume it discovered the same things in the same order, in the same way. Intelligence does not guarantee industrialization. Sophistication does not demand smoke and steel. It's possible, even likely, that an ancient civilization shaped by a different climate, different challenges, and a different worldview might have chosen a path we would not recognize as modern at all. Consider a civilization rooted in ecological harmony rather than domination. A society whose apex of achievement was not to bend nature to its will, but to live with it in balance. A culture that did not believe itself superior to the rest of the biosphere, but saw itself as part of it. It's easy to dismiss such a concept as naive, primitive, unsustainable. Yet we can observe similar dynamics in nature. In ant colonies, for instance, each member of the colony pursues tasks related to its physiology. Some ants farm, tending the fungus gardens in which the colony feeds. Other ants fight, defending the nest against intruders. Still others swarm and flood a threat with sheer numbers. The queen lays eggs, producing ever more ants to sustain the colony. From afar, an anthill may appear chaotic, but up close, there's a logic to it. Behavior emerges from simple interactions between individuals and the environment. Can we discern something similar in the archaeological record? It's hard to say. Many scholars believe early humans employed technologies sophisticated enough to meet their needs. In Africa, where humans evolved, we find evidence of tool use dating back 500,000 years. Those tools were crude by our standards, but suited to the task of scavenging carcasses and foraging. As humans migrated around the globe, we find evidence of new tools suited to new environments, including plows, boats, and weapons of war. Is it possible that somewhere along the line, one of these technologies allowed early humans to interface with their surroundings in a wholly new way? Not through conquest or exploitation, but through understanding and cooperation. We know that during the Holocene epoch, which began 12,000 years ago, the Earth was warmer than today. Global temperatures peaked around 9,500 years ago and have been declining since. During this period, we know that humans domesticated plants and animals and settled into villages. Is it possible that this was accomplished not through force but through reciprocity? Imagine a civilization that learned to read nature not as a dominion to be had, but as a series of relationships to be cultivated. It may sound fanciful, but it fits with what we know of human adaptability and intelligence. It also aligns with findings from the Yucatan, where archaeologists discovered evidence of ancient humans cultivating plants in a manner we might describe as symbiotic. They selected plants with desirable traits and encouraged their growth through selective breeding. But they didn't restrict the plants to neat rows or fences or fields. They grew wild, unconfined. This fits with a worldview that didn't separate humans from nature, but wove them together. It also hints at a level of sophistication in farming, one that modern science is only now rediscovering. But to develop such practices, you need time, and here is where our perspective fails. The Holocene epoch ended 11,700 years ago. Since then, the Earth has cooled, ice sheets have grown, sea levels have fallen, and humans have greatly expanded their technological capacity. It's easy to imagine a timeline that runs from hunting and gathering to agriculture to industrialization to where we are now. But it's equally possible that each of these phases unfolded over thousands of years. Maybe the shift from hunting and gathering to settled life was a slow, subtle process. People didn't suddenly decide to stay put and farm. They gradually experimented with domesticating plants and animals, perhaps beginning with preserving seeds from their favorite wild foods and then replanting them. Maybe they noticed that a plant they liked to eat grew near a particular animal whose young they already hunted. Maybe they started throwing scraps to the animals and then planting in proximity. Maybe they observed the habits of wild animals and mimicked those behaviors. Over many generations, maybe they found that the soil where they settled was poor and lacking in nutrients, so they brought in compost or manure and mixed it in. Maybe they even began to understand the role of microorganisms and their importance in growing healthy crops. This gradual process could have played out with other technologies as well, like plows and boats and weapons. Tools may have changed slowly, generation to generation, until one day they became efficient enough to support large groups of people living in one place. It's a subtle progression, hard to perceive on a map, impossible to mark on a timeline. This is the fallacy of our own experience. We don't remember the transition to farming or the adoption of iron tools or the Industrial Revolution as anything less than sudden. In fact, it took centuries, in some cases millennia, for these changes to become widespread. But this fallacy prevents us from imagining a much older civilization pursuing the same trajectory. Maybe the advancements of such a society were unrecognizable to us because they happened too slowly to be obvious. Or maybe they were easily erased by the next ice age, the rising sea levels, the next great migration. But what if an advanced civilization did develop technology recognizable to us, like metallurgy or astronomy or engineering, like cities and roads? Like ours, it rose and then fell, leaving behind only the barest chemical ghosts, traces of metals, foundations of buildings, shards of pottery, tools, and weapons. Are there any examples of this? We know that dozens of cultures around the world developed metallurgy independently, often within a few hundred years of each other. Copper tools have been dated to as early as 7,000 TARS BCE. Bronze and then iron soon followed. We also know that several cultures around the world built impressive structures, including the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Norte Chico civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. But how long did it take them to do so? Did it happen quickly or slowly? Again, we lack perspective. We tend to equate complexity with metal and progress with scale. But in doing so, we blind ourselves to other forms of advancement, the kinds that do not leave scars. Take the Dogon of Mali, for instance. Over several millennia, they created a culture with social structures and astronomical knowledge so complex it seems almost alien to Western observers. How did they do it without metal tools or towering monuments? The answer is nuance. Imagine a hunter-gatherer band with the social structure of a beehive. Members specialize in tasks based on their abilities and interests, not because someone appointed them to the position, but because everyone benefits from their contributions. As the group grows, so does the division of labor. Over time, the group becomes self-governing. Decisions are made democratically. Disputes are mediated by respected members. Stability becomes the norm. This stability could allow the group to thrive, to prosper. With security comes leisure. People have time to pursue interests, explore ideas, craft innovations. We don't think of hunter-gatherers as having much leisure time, but we also forget that they were not confined to a single territory or subject to the whims of unpredictable weather. Hunter-gatherers could follow food sources, could migrate to where conditions were clement, and resources were plentiful. They were not tethered to a single spot like farmers. And with freedom of movement came freedom of thought. In such a society, an individual could wander away if they disagreed with a leader or felt oppressed by rules. They could explore new ideas without fear of persecution, and that is why such a society might have thrived for generations or centuries, developing technology, building structures, making discoveries, without metal, without cities, without hierarchy. We call these characteristics primitive, but they are precisely what make us most afraid to consider them advanced. What if instead of looking for civilizations that mirrored our own, we looked for ones that didn't? What if we searched not for evidence of bronze and concrete, but biodegradable materials? What if we didn't look for towers, but for networks, a society that spread organically across the landscape, surviving for centuries because it solved problems without imposing solutions? Such a society might not leave ruins of stone, but gardens, patterns, soil enriched in strange ways, genetic traces in crops or animals long since naturalized. We tend to think of civilizations as complex, hierarchical, highly stratified. But what if we underestimated the longevity of egalitarian societies? What if we think of prehistory as a dark, unbroken mass because we can't see through it, because we don't want to see through it? Because what if we did and found something familiar staring back at us? Because what if we are walking over the graves of forgotten worlds and we don't know it? What if the dawn of civilization isn't a beginning, but the latest flicker of a very old flame? If such a civilization did once exist, sophisticated, complex, and long forgotten, then one question echoes above all others. What happened to it? The popular imagination leans toward catastrophe, great floods, cosmic impacts, sudden destruction. But in truth, the end of a civilization rarely comes in a single day or night. More often, it unravels slowly. Systems stretch, fray, collapse under weight they were never built to bear. We see it in the record we do have, the history we know. The Maya civilization in Mesoamerica, with its towering temples and refined astronomical knowledge, declined over centuries, not from a single cause but many: prolonged drought, deforestation, soil exhaustion, internal strife. Cities emptied, trade routes withered, a proud and brilliant culture dimmed to silence. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire collapsed after a period of intense drought, a once thriving urban network brought down by the slow failure of the rains. In the Indus Valley, signs of climate change coincide with urban abandonment. Once regular rivers shifted course, agricultural systems failed, and at each of these inflection points, people adapted. They moved, they survived, they changed. But the complexity that had sustained their golden ages was lost. So, what if the same has happened before, only deeper in time where records cannot reach? A society might rise, master its environment, even achieve great things. But the very complexity that makes civilization possible is also what makes it fragile. Networks are delicate. Infrastructure depends on balance. Technology, however advanced, cannot control the Earth itself, especially if that Earth begins to change. Consider the end of the last ice age. As glaciers retreated and sea levels rose, coastlines transformed. Fertile plains disappeared beneath water, climatic zones shifted. What had once been habitable, even ideal, became unstable. If a civilization had developed during the glacial period, perhaps along the vast coastal plains now buried by oceans, then sea level rise alone could have destroyed its heartlands. Cities, ports, farms, all drowned. The survivors, scattered inland, might have been unable to preserve what their ancestors had built. Add to this the threat of natural catastrophe. The Earth is not a gentle host. It has known extinction events, magnetic reversals, supervolcanoes, solar flares. Even a moderate volcanic eruption can trigger a global temperature drop. A large asteroid, like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, would leave almost no survivors. If such an event struck at the height of a civilization's power, it could erase it, not just physically but culturally. Survivors would revert to simpler forms of living. Knowledge would degrade within generations. Complex writing systems, mathematical concepts, scientific principles, all vulnerable to loss if they are not actively preserved. And perhaps the most haunting possibility of all, collapse from within, not by flood, not by fire, but by misjudgment, overreach, pollution, exhaustion of resources, inequality, war. We like to think of civilization as self-correcting, that wisdom accumulates, that progress is permanent. But history shows otherwise. Societies make mistakes, they overexploit, they divide, they ignore warning signs until it is too late. And if a society had done so long before our own, who would remain to tell their story? No one. Only soil and silence. Only the myths. The possibility of collapse is not a morbid curiosity. It is a mirror, one we must have the courage to look into. Because we too are complex. We too depend on fragile systems. We live in an age of extraordinary technological power and equally extraordinary vulnerability. Climate change, ecological loss, energy instability, artificial intelligence, even the quiet erosion of trust and truth. We do not yet know how our story ends. But if Earth has seen civilization rise before and fall, then we are not the first to face this question. We are simply the first to ask it from orbit. So perhaps the most urgent lesson of a lost civilization is not about their greatness, but their disappearance. The warning is not in what they built, it's in what they left behind. Nothing. We have found no evidence for agriculture or animal domestication in Europe during the entire Mesolithic period, which lasted there for some 20,000 years. No one knows what people were doing across much of that time, where they went, why they disappeared. I'm an archaeologist who studies prehistory in Britain. This is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. The conventional wisdom in archaeology is that human cultures change gradually over time. There are broad patterns like the shift from hunting and gathering to farming, which happened separately in several parts of the world around 12,000 years ago. But day-to-day life in prehistory was probably pretty similar from one generation to the next. The Mesolithic in Europe is supposed to have been a time when small groups of hunter-gatherers explored and exploited the new opportunities created by the post-glacial world. They hunted wild animals, fished in rivers and coastal waters, gathered wild plants and fruit, and lived in small, loosely organized groups. But we have found no evidence for this. We have found no Mesolithic sites in Britain at all. No middens, no settlements, no burials, nothing. We have found no evidence for agriculture or animal domestication in Europe during the entire Mesolithic period, which lasted there for some 20,000 years. No one knows what people were doing across much of that time, where they went, why they disappeared. It isn't just the Mesolithic either. Take the Neolithic, the period after the last ice age, when farming first emerged in Europe. Again, archaeologists think that big changes were happening in the way people lived, with more settled lifestyles and larger, more complex groups of people. But again, we have very little evidence for this in Britain. The oldest undisputed Neolithic site is just 5,000 years old. Before that, we have a few tantalizing clues. Flint axes made in distinctive styles, long barrows filled with cremated bone, and a smattering of other artifacts. but no one knows whether these were made by the same people or represent a break in occupation. All we can say with certainty is that Britain was uninhabited for 2,000 years after the ice sheet melted away, and that's hardly a surprise. If archaeologists in the 19th century had been asked to describe the Neolithic, they would probably have said that it began around 4000 BC with the arrival of farming. They would have described large, round houses filled with families living off their crops, herding their cattle and pigs and crafting fine pottery. In short, exactly what we find at the oldest sites in Britain. They would have been wrong. What we now call the Neolithic was a time when Britain was largely empty. The reality is that history works in its own logic. Human cultures do not evolve steadily through time. They collapse, societies die, people abandon places, and each of these events leaves a silence in the historical record. Each silence hides a story. As archaeologists, we can choose to ignore these silences, to fill in the gaps with educated guesses based on what we think must have happened. Or we can use the silences themselves as a source of information, asking questions about why something ended, about why people abandoned a place, what caused a culture to die, and most important, what happened next. These questions take us to the edge of our current knowledge, and that's where the excitement is. Take those gaps between the Ice Age and the Neolithic. Maybe they are evidence for huge cultural changes, for societies that collapsed and vanished, or maybe they tell us about environmental shifts, periods when Britain became too dry or too wet for people to live there. Or maybe they tell us about both. To answer those questions, my colleagues and I are working on long-term research projects that will shed light on these gaps. We are excavating prehistoric sites, analyzing ancient DNA, and developing new ways to date buried landscapes. Our job is to ask why. Why did people abandon the coast as sea levels rose? Why did they stop making beautiful flint tools? Why did such monumental tombs stop being used? Why did society break down? Each question takes us deeper into the past, helping us understand the forces that have shaped our world today. But here's the thing. No matter what we discover, there will be more questions. That's the nature of research, but that's also why it's such a privilege to be an archaeologist. The world is full of unanswered questions. History is full of silences, but they're not empty. They're waiting for us to listen. They're waiting for us to ask, why? The earth forgets. Stone wears away. Metal corrodes. Buildings fall. Stories fade. But the body remembers. Inside every human being is a code, a history written not in books or monuments, but in molecules, DNA. 4 letters, billions of characters. A record carried from generation to generation across thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. Our genes don't speak in names or dates, but they remember journeys, migrations, mergers, divides, bottlenecks, extinctions. They carry the traces of who we are and, perhaps, of who came before us. For most of the 20th century, archaeology told one story, and genetics told another. But in the 21st, those two fields have begun to converge, and what they reveal is more complex, and more mysterious than we once believed. Take the Denisovans. Until just a few decades ago, they were completely unknown, a vanished branch of the human family tree. No ruins, no tools, no cave art, just a sliver of bone found in a cave in Siberia. And from that sliver, an entire population was discovered, one that lived alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years. We never found their cities, if they had any. We don't know their names or their stories, but we carry their DNA. Up to 5% of the genome of some modern human populations, particularly in Oceania and Southeast Asia, comes from them. A people lost to history, preserved only in the living, and they are not alone. Neanderthals, too, live within us. Once seen as brutish and inferior, they are now understood to have made art, tools, music. They buried their dead. They tended the sick, and they interbred with our ancestors. Today, nearly all non-African humans carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA. This raises a profound idea that entire populations, entire cultures, can vanish from the archaeological record and yet still survive within us, not as memory, but as code, not as legend, but as sequence. So what else might be hidden there? If an ancient civilization rose and fell in the deep past, tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, it's possible that their genes still echo in ours, in subtle traits, in adaptive advantages, in patterns we have not yet learned to decode. After all, most of our genome is still a mystery. We understand the basics, the building blocks, the switches, but the vast intergenic regions, the so-called junk DNA, are poorly understood. Within them may lie evolutionary experiments, forgotten adaptations, legacies of peoples long vanished from the physical world, but still alive in the cellular one. Even cultural behaviors may have genetic components, tendencies toward cooperation, language use, environmental awareness. These are shaped by both nature and nurture. And if certain traits proved advantageous in past civilizations, they may have been passed down, selected for, preserved, even as the cultures themselves collapsed and were forgotten. This is not fantasy. It is the logic of evolution. Genes do not care whether a culture left monuments. They care only that it survived long enough to reproduce. So the next time we marvel at the silence of the past, at how little remains from the deep stretches of human prehistory, we might also consider that part of that past still walks the earth. In us, the shape of a cheekbone, the color of an eye, a quirk of metabolism, a cognitive edge. Every human being is a mosaic of ancient stories, most of which we will never read in full. But some chapters, however faint, still echo. And if we learn to listen carefully enough, we may yet begin to understand not only where we came from, but who came before us. A discovery like that would turn our world upside down. If definitive proof were to emerge of a lost civilization 50,000 years ago, what would happen? Initially, probably disbelief. The idea that humanity's cradle is 10,000 years old is so ingrained that anything else seems impossible. There would be a scramble to explain the discovery away, to make it fit our conventional story. Scholars would be skeptical, institutions cautious. The idea would have to fight its way into the mainstream, but over time, the weight of evidence would be impossible to ignore. And slowly, like a glacier cracking under pressure, the story would begin to change. Textbooks would be rewritten, museums rearranged, the historical narrative restructured. But beyond the institutions, what of us? What of me? How would it feel to learn we are not the first? That all we've built, all we've imagined, all our wonder and invention is not unprecedented. For some, it would be deeply unsettling. We place ourselves at the pinnacle of human achievement. We imagine a line that rises from the caves to the stars, and we see ourselves as the cutting edge, the final chapter. But this would reveal we are just a page. Not alone, not the first, not inevitable. We would have to let go of certain myths, not the myths of Atlantis or sunken continents, but the deeper myth of our exceptionalism, the idea that we are the natural destined result of evolution's long march. That intelligence must lead to us. Instead, we would see ourselves as inheritors, one branch in a tree whose other limbs have broken, fallen, disappeared into the soil. That can be a frightening thought, but it can also be liberating. Because if others came before us, rose, flourished, then vanished, it means we are part of a deeper tradition, a human tradition that spans not centuries, but eons. It also means the future is open, not fixed, not linear, a story not of progress, but of possibility. Some would take this discovery as a warning. If it happened once, it can happen again. Civilizations are not indestructible. They are fragile systems balanced on a changing Earth. What destroyed them may still be possible in our own time: climate instability, environmental collapse, weapons of our own making. But others would see hope. If a civilization could rise in the past, despite all odds in an ice age, in conditions we consider primitive, then perhaps resilience is in our nature. Perhaps our species is not a one-time miracle, but a persistent force, a builder, a rememberer, a dreamer, and perhaps, just perhaps, the echoes of that older civilization remain, not only in our genes, but in our myths, in the stories we tell of golden ages lost, of great floods, of gods who fell from the sky, of knowledge passed down in whispers, generation to generation. What if those stories are not just allegories? What if they are memories, distorted, yes, fragmented, but memories nonetheless? To find proof of a lost civilization would not just shift science, it would shift identity, it would humble us, remind us that we are not the authors of civilization, but its stewards, that others may have walked this road before, stumbled, and that if we wish to avoid the same fate, we must learn not only from our present, but from a past we do not yet fully understand. And now, for a special treat, we bring you a message from the future. Hello from the year 2034. You may be wondering why my skin is green. That's because everyone's skin turns green after we discovered the extent of our own stupidity. See, it turns out the global warming we so confidently predicted did happen. But it wasn't the polar bears who suffered most. It was us. Turns out melting ice caps and rising sea levels go hand in hand with mass extinctions. Whoops. But it's not all bad news. The humans who survived global warming also discovered something incredible. Buried deep beneath the sands of the Sahara, they found a vast underground city. We think it was built by aliens, but we're not sure. What they found was way too advanced for any human civilization at the time. The buildings were perfectly preserved, complete with functioning robots and enough food to sustain a small army for hundreds of years. They also found strange devices that seemed to harness unknown forms of energy. And then there were the texts, indecipherable glyphs etched onto durable metal plates. There were no bodies, no signs of violence, no obvious reason for the city's abandonment. It was as if the inhabitants had vanished into thin air. So, of course, the few remaining humans decided to settle in the city and make it their own. Since they didn't have much else to do. After all, the entire North African desert was now underwater. Turns out the oceans really do rise, but not in the way we expected. So anyway, we haven't actually deciphered any of the alien text yet. No one's brave enough to mess with that kind of tech. But it doesn't matter. Not really. I mean, imagine being alive in the year 2024 and knowing things that no one else knows. Things about the future, about the past, about aliens. Imagine having access to knowledge that could change the world. Like, why haven't you subscribed to our channel yet? Come on, you know you want to. Go ahead, we'll wait. Okay, seriously? You should subscribe? We won't bite. Much? Okay, bye.